Unless you've done nothing for the last few years except binge watch every show on Netflix, you probably know that immigration, refugees, and asylum seekers have become a pretty hot topic in the US and around the world. Like most countries, Israel has its own general immigration policies. But it also provides a unique protection that's specific for Jews across the globe. This is called the Law of Return. This law grants legal permission for any Jew from anywhere to settle in Israel and has established modern Israel as a homeland and a haven for the international Jewish community. But isn't that, kind of discriminatory? I mean, why should there be such a law? And if it's specific to Jews, then, well, who's a Jew and how exactly should Jewishness be determined? These questions aren't new. They were asked by Israel's founders themselves. But before we get into all of that, we'll need to start by taking a look at the world in which this law of return first emerged. For nearly 2 millennia, up until the creation of the State of Israel, Jewish populations scattered across the world lived in a continual state of minority status and were often subjected to terrible persecution. Jews effectively became perpetual refugees. This is the world in which the Jewish people's longing for an independent homeland existed only in their imagination, through hope and prayer, as a central part of Jewish liturgy, practice, and identity. Now, by the mid-19th century, more than 5 million Jews, or 40% of the world's Jewish population, lived in Tsarist Russia, where they were subjected to such severe persecution that more than 2 million Jews emigrated to other countries over a period of just a few decades. Fleeing persecution and inspired by Zionism, many of these Jewish refugees, and Jews from other countries, made their way to the land of Israel. Those long-held hopes and prayers for an independent homeland finally began to materialize. But not quite yet. And by the time Nazism was on the rise in Germany in the 1930s, and the danger to its Jews becoming increasingly clear, the Jews' need for a place of asylum reached a fever pitch. To address this crisis, the United States convened the Evian Conference in the summer of 1938. 32 countries assembled to develop an international plan for the growing number of Jewish refugees seeking to flee Germany. But the effort failed to reach any agreement, as only one country was willing to significantly increase its immigration of Jewish refugees. The remaining 31, including the US, who had called for the conference, effectively resolved to leave the vast majority of the Jews to their fate in Germany. Then, just a few months before the start of World War II, the British Parliament passed the White Paper, which placed severe restrictions on Jewish immigration into British-controlled Palestine. A quota of 15,000 Jews each year was set and continued throughout the war. So the result of both the Evian Conference and the White Paper was the deaths of possibly hundreds of thousands who may have otherwise fled from the increasing danger in Europe. It's against this bleak backdrop, after the horrors of the Second World War, when 6 million Jews were systematically murdered, that the founders of the State of Israel endeavored to establish a policy of protection for Jews across the globe. This policy came to be known as the Law of Return and granted a fundamental right to Jews around the world who sought to enter and live in the developing country. Essentially, it was created as a policy of automatic asylum designed to provide a refuge for Jews. And even during the first few years it was being debated and drafted, it was already being put to use. During this time, approximately 600,000 refugees immigrated to Israel, doubling the Jewish population. Many of them were Holocaust survivors who had been abandoned by the international community during the war. But the principle of the Law of Return was also saving Jews not only in Europe, but across the Middle East and North Africa. Operation Magic Carpet was a secret rescue mission of nearly 50,000 Yemenite Jews. They were fleeing famine, disease, as well as general hostility and violence that had developed towards Jews in most Muslim nations following Israel's independence. And so, over a period of about 1 year, more than 85% of Yemen's entire Jewish population was airlifted out of Yemen and taken to Israel. And this trend would continue as Jews fled other Muslim countries. Over the following decade, more than 850,000 Jewish immigrants from these countries came to Israel under the Law of Return. By the end of the 50s, the influx of refugee immigrants from Europe and the Middle East tripled the population of the new state. It's clear why this law was needed. But it was also necessary to establish this law within Israel's emerging democracy. The drafters of the new state's immigration policies took care to ensure that their laws somehow remained non-discriminatory. Not an easy task. So how did they pull this off? Well, this right of automatic asylum provided by the Law of Return was not, by itself, also a right of automatic citizenship. The Law of Return would provide automatic residency, but citizenship was to be granted by a second law, the Citizenship Law, which would extend citizenship to other groups as well. Passed in 1952, this citizenship law provided several paths to citizenship. One would be through the Law of Return, which applied to any Jews who had or would return in the future. Another path would be through residents, Arabs, Christians, Druze, and others who were already living in Israel at the time of its establishment would become citizens of the new state pretty much automatically. A third path to citizenship would be available to more recent and future non-Jewish immigrants through a process of naturalization similar to many other countries. And the fourth, and probably easiest path, would be birth to an Israeli citizen. But back to the Jews who arrived under the law of return. Didn't that law automatically grant them citizenship? Why did they need this new citizenship law? Well, actually, the law of return itself doesn't really grant any citizenship. It provides asylum and is used as one of the methods of determining citizenship. Now, this may seem like it's just convoluted semantics, but this is actually a very important legal distinction. Even if the citizenship law was amended and did away with the path provided by the law of return, it wouldn't actually affect the law of return itself and the automatic asylum that it provides. Bottom line, these laws are quite confusing and nuanced, and neither of them, the citizenship law nor the law of return, is set in stone. In fact, both laws may be amended by a simple majority vote in Israel's Knesset, and they have been many, many times. And this brings us to the trickiest question. If the law of return is to be based on one's Jewishness, then who is a Jew? Jews have identified themselves over the centuries in multiple ways, so what does the law of return consider to be the deciding factor? Well, when the law of return was first passed, it actually didn't provide any clarity about who would be considered a Jew. It simply relied on the immigration authorities, who defined a Jew as any person who professes to be one and who has not embraced any other religion. To put it another way, Israel takes your word for it. But this makes for a pretty broad definition, and it was tested in several court cases during the first 2 decades of the state. As a result, an amendment to the law of return was passed in 1970, which provided for the first time a legislative definition of who is a Jew. The amendment defined a Jew as a person who was born of a Jewish mother or who had become converted to Judaism and who is not a member of another religion. In other words, a narrower definition than previously. But wrap your head around this. Even though the new definition of a Jew was narrowed, the amended law also expanded the right of asylum beyond this definition to anyone who had at least one Jewish grandparent or who is married to someone with at least one Jewish grandparent. Effectively, this meant that not only could anyone considered a Jew under the new definition have the right to enter and live in the land, but so could their spouses, children, and grandchildren, and the spouses of their children and grandchildren, regardless of their religion. Controversially, this extension was based on the Nuremberg laws of Nazi Germany. Now, it's pretty clear why people might have a problem with using Nazi policy to determine Jewish identity. But actually, the Nuremberg laws were not being used to answer the narrow question of who is a Jew, but only to determine the broader question of who would be protected under Israel's law of return. The idea being that anyone who would have been subjected to persecution under such heinous laws should also be able to find refuge and protection from those laws. By the mid-1980s and early 1990s, this amended definition would also include Ethiopian Jews fleeing persecution and famine. Also in the 90s, Israel began to experience massive immigration under the law of return by Jews from the former Soviet Union. From 1990 to 1999, over 800,000 Soviet Jewish refugees arrived in Israel, a massive number for any country to absorb, let alone a small country like Israel. But the most challenging questions for the law of return may still lie ahead. As political tensions continue to mount around the world concerning issues of ethnic and national identity, Israel will continue to struggle with this question. How do you remain both a liberal democracy and a Jewish state? While much of Israel's history demonstrates that these two ideals don't have to be mutually exclusive, the complexities of immigration and nationality remain an ongoing and often contentious debate. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.